Marcus Garvey said a people without knowledge of their past, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots. So let's think about it. How many of the issues we face today are rooted in the mistakes of yesterday? As we look toward the next 50 years of independence, what lessons are we still learning? Within the life of this independent Bahamas, many men and women have emerged as leaders in many different ways. From frontline politics to scholars on law, the Constitution, and policy, our guest tonight perfectly fits that description. He's a former Attorney General, leader of government business in the Senate, party chairman, chairman of the Judicial Review Commission, and King's Counsel. Sean McWeeney sits down with us tonight here on The Record as we look at the Bahamas then and now, 50 years of reflections. Our discussion begins on the other side of this break. Well, tonight's guest was called to the Bahamas bar back in 1978. He entered frontline politics as a senator in 1985 and served up until 1992. A part of that time, he served as leader of government business in the Senate. In 1989, he served as the Attorney General, a post he held up until 1992. And in 2009, he was admitted to the inner bar as Queen's Counsel. We are honored to have Sean McWeeney, Casey, as our guest here on The Record tonight. He's a senior partner in Graham Thompson, one of the nation's largest and oldest firms. Sir, welcome to On The Record. Good to have you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Jerome.
I have to say, for the benefit of my audience, we have been having this discussion to have you on the show for a long time, and I thought it was very important to have you because I know that there are some perspectives you can provide to our conversation, and tonight we're going to have that conversation. Mr. McWeeney's political involvement dates back to 1969 when he was elected as president of Unicom at the age of 60. And now I have to ask you, first of all, what inspired you to become involved in politics at that time in that group?
Well, I think I had already begun to demonstrate an interest in the wider world outside of school. I was at St. Augustine's at the time, finishing off there, and I had started to get involved in debating societies, that sort of thing. And I took part in a debate at the old government high school, and there was a group that was having a meeting there, and Franklin Wilson, now Sir Franklin Wilson, approached me after the meeting and said that he wanted me to join this movement that they had called Unicall. I think it was in transition then to Unicom, but it was the same organization. And so I joined, and a year later I was elected president. I was the youngest guy in the group. So Franklin and his crowd were, much older. But they elected me president the following year in '69, I think it was. And that was it.
In doing my research and reading about this, it seemed that there was a sense amongst a group of young men and young women with a pride and focus towards national development. What was the impetus for that? What was the driving force, or what was your motivation?
I think it has to be seen in the context of the attainment of majority rule in 1967, which represented a reawakening of the Bahamian spirit, so to speak. it was a brand new day in many respects. And it had a galvanizing effect on youth, or certainly progressive youth. And a part of that process was a much greater interest in the body politic, a much greater interest in finding a way to personally impact the process by participating in either a mainstream political party or, in my case, a definitely non-mainstream organization like Unicom, which was quite critical of the mainstream political parties and in many respects was way ahead of them. We were the first organization to consistently sound the call for independence, for example. It was only much later that the mainstream parties, took it on as a part of their agenda. So we were very progressive in that way. We were also, I think, quite frankly, very socialist in our view of things economic. Things like National Youth Service, that was the sort of thing we would have been talking about in the late 60s. But our main thrust was to accelerate the process of decolonization. And that's why we did some things which were regarded as quite crazy at the time, like burning the Union Jack on Clifford Park in the middle of the Queen's annual birthday celebrations. People were mortified.
I want to go back to that because that's literally was my next question. So Unicom was described as a leading pro-independence radical left-wing pressure group.
Yes.
Burned the Union Jack on Clifford Park in 1969 in protest against colonialism.
That's correct.
How was that received?
I think people were, some people were outraged over it. Some people thought we should have been prosecuted. I think, there were a lot of dropped jaws around town. Because something like this had never been done before, really. So I think it was more shock and horror than anything else. But I think people saw it as a principled demonstration. It wasn't as if we were out there as vandals. We were trying to make a point, and the accompanying interviews, indicated to the public what our main focus is, why we were doing it. It was a symbolic protest against colonialism and a call for an accelerated move to independence, which of course occurred 4 years later.
Of course, it's tied really right into my next question. It seemed that helped to really propel the independence movement and amongst a young generation of Bahamians.
Well, I think it did. It did. And it also brought about, I think, a much closer connection between Unicom and the mainstream political party that was then in power, namely the Progressive Liberal Party, because we created platforms here in Nassau in particular for discussion, public discussion of such things as independence. And so we would invite, for example, the Honorable A.D. Hanna, who was far and away the principal proponent of independence in the PLP at the time, people like Loftus Roker, who was also, very much in support of it. So that we sort of found common cause with what I would call the nationalistic wing of the PLP, the more progressive wing of the PLP. So Arthur Folks also, I would have included in that category as well back then.
In 1970, again, something I learned just this week in just reading and researching, in 1970 you were embroiled in a major public controversy for an inflammatory public address you made as head boy, criticizing the lack of Bahamianization of both the school and faculty, school faculty and curriculum at Queen's College, and ultimately were expelled. What motivated you to make that speech?
Because those were things that I thought were things that were really fundamentally wrong with the school and needed to be addressed. I was quite surprised, really, at the reaction to it. I certainly didn't think I was going to get expelled for it. But I think that was a part of a much larger story, which I didn't quite appreciate at the time. There were other forces at work within the Methodist Church. They were clearly mobilizing against the then headmaster, Reverend Neville Stewart. But that's a very complex picture. But I was very concerned. Of course, I was in my radical phase of personal development, and I was concerned about the fact that at QC, you had a school which was still, it was progressive in a racial sense, in the sense that it didn't suffer from the rank segregation that characterized its earlier years. There was, in fact, a much more aggressive move towards racial integration. But at the same time, there was very little movement in terms of the teaching staff. The teaching staff, with very few exceptions, were English. And I couldn't see any real interest, frankly, in even trying to recruit Bahamian teachers. And parallel with that, there wasn't any interest in developing any sort of Bahamian curriculum. So I like to give the example that we all knew the length and depth of the Thames River in London, but we didn't know anything about Bahamian geography or Bahamian history. Wow. It just wasn't on the radar. So those are the two main things I dealt with in my address. And I also dealt with what I thought was a social responsibility which the school had abandoned, had abdicated, and that was to allow its facilities to be used by the less affluent part of the neighborhood in which the school was located, namely the Kemp Road community. Because at the time, there was a keen interest in underprivileged youngsters in the Kemp Road area to use the basketball court and other sporting facilities after school. So it wasn't as if they would have been in any way, treading on what the students were doing. And that became a big controversy. When I was head boy, which incidentally was a position to which I was appointed, wasn't elected, I was appointed by the same headmaster who eventually put me out. But I saw this as an issue that the school needed to deal with, and it wasn't dealing with it. So that was really the third plank of my address.
You were a teenager.
I was 17 at the time.
And you are taking on issues of Bahamianization and discrimination, or lack of Bahamianization, or lack of Bahamianization of the curriculum. How, and of course this now expulsion happens, how did that help to propel you even further into the spotlight?
Well, I think it certainly knocked me for a loop, because I sort of drifted about, not in a daze, but I sort of started doing different things which I hadn't planned to do, because I had gone to QC in order to get my A-levels, so that I would then have the necessary academic qualifications to go to England to study law, which at the time was the most popular way of qualifying for the bar. So I really couldn't do that anymore because I couldn't get the A-levels. I'd have to do private courses, and that was a very difficult thing. So I ended up going to work as a journalist for a while after I got kicked out. I worked for the Bahamian Times as a journalist, as a reporter. And then I sort of segued into the trade union movement for a while. I was working with the Bahamas Federation of Trade Unions, as it then was, and the Airport Allied Workers Union. And then after that, I eventually got back into the law as an article law clerk. So I actually did my law studies here, beginning in 1973. But that was a 3-year gap. I was kicked out in 1970, and it took me 3 years really to get back on stride, towards my legal career. So you then were called to the bar and eventually entered politics. In 1984, you were elected chairman of the Progressive Liberal Party, where you served up until 1989. I want to talk about those years within the PLP and within the country. Even prior to coming on here, I talked about, as a teenager in the 80s, what it was like for me, watching all of these things happening in the country through the eyes of a teenager. But within frontline politics, as the chairman of a party that, in my estimation, was at the height of its popularity, what were those years like? Incredibly tumultuous. Incredibly tumultuous. People talk about politics today. Politics today is a picnic compared to the way it was back then. I often say that. Yeah, I remember as a child people observing. People get so agitated at what's happening now, but this is nothing compared to how tumultuous those years were when I was chairman, 1984 to 1989. To begin with, when I became chairman, the party, the PLP, was in a state of internal revolt. A.D. Hanna was no longer in the cabinet. Hubert Ingram and Perry Christie had been expelled from the cabinet. You had the drug allegations that were made by NBC. It was a major topic in the House of Assembly here as well. And the whole nation was in the grip of these crises. The internal dissension within the PLP, and then the broader issues affecting the country, reputationally and otherwise. And so I stepped into this cauldron as chairman of the PLP. And it was a hell of a time. It was a hell of a time. I mean, looking back, I think I can say that I enjoyed it, mainly because I was a chairman who had the support of the leader, Sir Lyndon Pendling. I was, in fact, probably his closest political ally back then. So, and he gave me free rein to do what I wanted to do really as chairman. And I think everybody in the party realized that too. So that made it easier to get things done as chairman of the party. But it was a very difficult time in the sense that there was never a dull moment. It was always something which was going askew. Mm-hmm. And the opposition had come to life. I think Cecil Wallace Whitfield was the chairman was the leader of the F&M at the time. And so, the House of Assembly, where I spent a lot of time visiting as chairman, was a lot of member, was, the level of debate, the intensity of debate was, I think, quite frankly, unparalleled.
One of the elections that continues to fascinate me is the 1987 election. And I want to spend a little time talking about
the one everybody
that.
thought the PLP was going to lose.
I was about to say, depending on who you ask, F&Ms will tell you it was stolen. Yeah. PLPs will tell you it was a hard-fought election. Yeah. But that was such a pivotal election for the country.
It really was. It really was. I didn't have any doubt as chairman that we were going to win. And we won fair and square. But opposition parties then did what they do now. They cry foul when they lose because they have to convince their supporters that it wasn't because of their own failings that they lost. So we went through that experience where they claimed that it was stolen, but there was no basis for it. They knew full well it was won fair and square. People still had grave concerns about the F&M, about Cecil Wallace Whitfield in particular, about his leadership. Many people thought he was just too dictatorial in nature. There were a lot of people who were still uncomfortable about the fusion of the UBP and the Free PLP. I think, frankly, the PLP also traded on the fact that they'd been doing this for so long. Mm-hmm. It was the only party that could really bring the stability and the experience, to governance in the country. So we in the PLP weren't surprised by it, but I know that the F&M was shocked by it. I remember driving home from party headquarters on the night of the election, and I had never heard Nassau as quiet as that in my life. Wow. People were just stunned. Wow. Certainly F&Ms were stunned.
In 1989, you were appointed Attorney General. In many ways, we're still a young country. During your tenure, you introduced computerized court reporting systems. Night Court increased the number of judges, magistrates, and prosecutors, along with laws for the financial services sector were modernized. Why were these things so important to the judicial system at that time when you took over? And I think the record may still reflect you were probably the youngest Attorney General in the country's history.
Yeah, I was the youngest in the Commonwealth. Yeah, I was 35 when I became Attorney General in 1989. And looking back, I'm very proud, frankly, of the things that I was able to accomplish. And again, I have to give a lot of the credit for that to Sir Lyndon, mm-hmm. because whatever I needed, I think he was Minister of Finance when I became Attorney General. It may have been Paul Adler, I'm not sure. But he was extremely supportive around the cabinet table. And if I brought a program to cabinet for approval, such as the computerized court reporting, to take one example, he was always enthusiastically in support of it. That enabled me and my ministry to basically access the budgetary resources that were needed for these programs, and to make sure that they were brought on stream, in a timely and effective manner. So at the time, though, we were suffering from a number of problems. One of which was that Paul Adley, God rest his soul, my very dear friend, who was my predecessor, had developed a bit of a problem with the bar, and was really not on speaking terms with the bar. So that was my first challenge, to address that problem, which I think I did quite effectively, and to get the bar reinvested in the whole process of reforming the legal profession, assisting in modernizing the processes of the judiciary and so on. And so things of the kind that you mentioned, the introduction of real-time computerized reporting which was quite the thing back then. This is, over 30 years ago. Those things had an immediate impact. People don't realize that back in those days, judges sat and wrote down every single thing that you said. So it had a dilating effect on the length of trials. It was crazy. It was so Dickensian. And so the introduction of computerized reporting changed that. We also quite dramatically increased the number of magistrates. We increased the number of Supreme Court judges. We turned the Court of Appeal from a court that sat periodically throughout the year to a court that was basically sitting full time. So all of these things were directed towards reducing the backlog, which I thought we did quite a good job at during the time that I was there.
Excellent. Well, this is a good place for us to take a break. Folks, you're watching On the Record. We'll be back with more in just a moment. Then and now, 50 years of reflections. That's our discussion on the record tonight with former Attorney General Sean McWeeney. On the occasion of the Silver Jubilee of Bahamian independence, sir, you were recognized for your outstanding contribution to national development in the area of law and awarded the Silver Jubilee Medal. Between 1999 and 2002, you served as chairman of the Judicial Review Commission and appointed chairman of the steering committee responsible for overseeing the restructuring of the police force. Today, crime and the fear of crime are tearing away at our social and even our economic and moral fiber, I think. How have we found ourselves as a country in such a state where crime seems to be permeating every segment of society and affecting our lives in so many ways?
I think the causes are manifold, and I think we would be here all day, putting, first line labels on them. But I think a lot of it is attributable to the breakdown that we experienced in the 80s and 90s. There certainly was a breakdown in the nuclear family structure. The drug epidemic, as you quite correctly described it, certainly was a major contributing factor. I think liberal trends in the world generally, unfortunately, had a dark side to it in the sense that it caused a decline in the sense of personal responsibility that we had before. So I think that there were many causes, and in fact, this is a problem that societies, large and small, first world and third world, have been contending with for the last 30, 40 years, throughout the world. So it's by no means unique to the Bahamas, but I think you're quite right that it's not only crime, but the fear of crime that has had such a negatively transfiguring effect on the Bahamian psyche, and is continuing to have that effect as we speak. And it's going to be a long time before we get on top of it. I think one of the problems we have had is that politicians of successive governments have tended to downplay the problem by saying that they have the magic bullet, they have the solutions, just put us in power and it'll be, no crime problem anymore. A lot of parties say that to get elected. But in fact, it's a dishonest approach because there is no, swift solution to crime. A part of the problem too, mind you, is the fact that there have been developments in the law in the period that we're talking about, which have made it more difficult for the police and for the society generally. For example, when I was called to the bar, 44 years ago, the idea of getting bail for murder, was unheard of. It's unheard of. And I remember there was one occasion when a pregnant woman was granted bail by, I think it was the then Chief Justice Leonard Knowles, and people were scandalized by this. And then, of course, the law developed in a way where, bail was seen as something which was inevitable, where you couldn't give the accused person, a trial within a reasonable period of time. And that, in turn, was a result of the congestion of the court system. So where you had somebody who was sitting in jail, languishing in jail, with the presumption of innocence for 3-4 years, the courts understandably said, no, this is intolerable. You need to release these people on bail. And I think the courts did it for salutary reasons too. I think they thought that this would have had a positive effect on law enforcement, the Attorney General's office, the police, in terms of trying to bring a quicker pace to trials. Of course, it hasn't really worked that way because crime continues to mushroom. But it has to be seen against that backdrop, because unfortunately there are limits to how quickly you can speed the process up. Everybody is entitled to a fair hearing. That's a fundamental requirement of the Constitution. The idea of the old Wild West, that you arrest somebody, you try him and hang him the same day. Those days are gone forever.
Sure.
But it's a very serious problem, because you look at the number of people who are out on bail and they get murdered, right? That in itself is an indictment of the system, because what people are saying when they do that is that they don't have any confidence in the judicial system to give them the justice that they seek for the loss of loved ones. So what do? They go and they practice their own justice. Again, quote unquote, in the old days, if you even go back to the 1950s, the 1940s, you would have seen that the average time between the arrest of someone for murder and the execution of that person, or if they're found guilty, was something like maybe 3 months.
Wow.
3 months, 3-4 months maybe. Because appeals to the Privy Council, of course, were very, very limited back then. And back then we didn't even have a Court of Appeal. Remember, the Court of Appeal only came into being here in the 1960s. So you had a judicial system which was simpler in terms of its construct. And the concern for human rights, giving a full and fair hearing, those concerns were certainly not as developed and as sophisticated as they are now. So you have to allow the accused the right to defend himself, and that means calling witnesses, making legal arguments. And there's no way you can have a system where you shut that out, because you might as well throw everything out there.
The issue of bail is also at the heart of the debate over crime. Repeat offenders on bail are given or granted bail, or giving bail to those accused of serious offenses. It's an issue that I raised in the last episode of this show with Chief Justice Ian Winder. Let's take a look at what he had to say.
Let's say you were granted bail. You had committed that you were charged with the offense of murder. You were granted bail. You could have been, you could have been in custody for 2-3 years prior. The fact that you have multiple offenses doesn't mean that in that period you could not have been in custody for a considerable period of time. If you're not going to be tried within a reasonable time, you have a right to be released. And the fact that you are charged with committing another murder whilst you're on bail, doesn't just add up to say that you were on bail for multiple. You have to look at all of the factors and not just the nature of the charge.
Chief Justice, speaking of the issue of bail, he contends the solution, though, is to dispose of these trials faster. Is it that simple?
That's the only solution, really. He's absolutely right. That's the only solution. Because he's quite right. The problem is that if it's intolerable to have people locked up for 3 or 4 years, as I said, with the presumption of innocence, the constitutional presumption of innocence, and still no trial in sight. So this problem goes away once you can get trials, conducted and concluded within a reasonable period of time. The issue of bail then goes away. But right now, I mean, the volume is such that this is going to continue to be a problem for a long time to come. Mind you, I find it amazing that so many murder accused are still applying for bail, considering what the odds look like nowadays.
You safer inside.
Exactly. But it shows you how strong the impulse for freedom is.
Yeah. During that interview, we also spoke about the need for evidentiary hearings prior to the start of the trial as a means to shortening the time it takes to hear matters. To the casual observer like me, that would seem like an easy fix.
Well, as I said, I think the problem is that you really cannot curtail the defendant's ability to conduct his defense the way he would wish to do so within the framework of the existing rules, okay? And if somebody wants to call, 5, 10 witnesses and they all have something relevant to say, if the accused wants to mount, a series of legal arguments which will take him a day or so to make, there's no way you can prevent him from doing that, because all that's going to happen is if you try to rush it, the appellate courts will strike it down and say that you violated his constitutional right to not only a speedy trial, but a fair trial. And fairness means allowing the accused the ability to present his case in a reasonable way. So that's a problem. I think to some extent, we are hamstrung by the fact that we do in fact have a judicial system which has all of these checks and balances, which unfortunately translate into a elongation of time, when they play out in a real world context. Try as you might, if you have a murder trial, for example, which involves half a dozen witnesses, the presentation of forensic evidence, for example, which very often calls for in-depth cross-examination. There's a limit to how much you can shrink the time that such a trial would take without violating the constitutional principles of a fair hearing.
In 2017, following a high-profile motion, you criticized the constitutional system that gave at the time prosecutor powers to the Attorney General. At the time, you were calling for those powers to vest in an independent Department of Public Prosecutions, the DPP. Now that we have a DPP appointed by the Judicial and Services Commission, how independent is that office from the Attorney General, in your opinion?
Empirically, in real world terms, I think it does function in the way it was intended to. I think there is a high degree of independence. I'm not aware of cases where the Attorney General is, trying to influence, prosecutorial decisions as to who should or should not be prosecuted. And I think the police will back that up. They have a direct line to the DPP and the DPP officials, and the Attorney General is pretty much removed from that process now. And that is a very healthy development. When I was Attorney General, I was the one who said, I think this is an awful system we have. Because when I was Attorney General, the Attorney General had full prosecutorial powers. He was the be-all and end-all for prosecutions. There was no DPP. We had a Solicitor General who internally, within the Office of the Attorney General, was responsible for criminal prosecutions. But the decisions were made by the Attorney General. And that was an awful system. An awful system, and it worked horribly because it really called into question so often the role of a politician in the administration of justice. I remember one of the most painful things I had to do as Attorney General was to prosecute one of our own MPs for bribery. I think it's the only successful prosecution there has been of a sitting MP.
Wilbert
he went
Moss,
to
the late Wilbert Moss.
He went to jail. But I caught eternal hell for that, even within my own party. There were a number of times when I just had to walk out of the cabinet room because people were trying to raise discussions. Never Sir Lyndon, I must say. He was always very circumspect and proper with these things. But there were some ministers who, tried to vent. And of course, I would have no discussion. I never, ever discussed prosecutorial decisions in cabinet. Never, never, ever.
Which raises another question. You, in many instances, will function as the Attorney General. You function as government lawyer, I would think. How difficult is that balancing the needs and wants and policies of a party that's governing with the rule of law?
I don't think it's that much of a problem in terms of functioning as the government's lawyer. because I think that's a recognized role of the Attorney General. And it works quite well in practice, because what happens is that you get your quote-unquote instructions, for example, on drafting new legislation from the responsible ministry. If, for example, it has something to do with road traffic, you're going to get instructions from the Minister of Transport, as it was in my time. And so it tends to be, narrowly developed within that process. The client, for all intents and purposes, is the Minister of Transport, and the Attorney General is the person, or his office is the unit that is, developing and refining the legislation. So I don't think that is a problem. I think where it is a problem in terms of the functions of the Attorney General is in relation to things which involve, the wider body politic. Making decisions concerning politicians, for example, where no matter how you decide it, you're going to come in for criticism from one side or the other. And, questions are raised as to whether you were objective in the making of those decisions.
On the issue of the independence of the DPP, just one question here. If the funding is still associated with the Attorney General's office, it would seem whomever writes the check calls the shots, and that's always a question.
Well, that's a criticism that has been made by or on behalf of the judiciary itself, that the judiciary doesn't really control its own purse strings, and I think that is what needs to be changed even more than the DPP. I think I certainly support a revision, a reform of the existing arrangements, under which the judiciary really has to go cap in hand, to the public treasury, albeit usually via the office of the Attorney General, to get the funding that it needs. I think we really need to develop a system under which there is a separate appropriation of public funds, which, and the funds are made directly available to some secretariat for the judiciary, so that they don't have to go and get put a cabinet paper forward to get something done. They don't have to go to the Attorney General and convince him it's a good idea. I think that would be a major constitutional reform, but I think that one that's really needed.
To what extent, as the state of our judicial system, I'm talking about the continuous delays in the court, legislation that's lagging behind in terms of the needs of a modern society, how have these things helped to stifle and even strangle progress in some ways?
Well, I think it's fundamental to the continued progress of the Bahamas that it must be seen to have a properly functioning system for the administration of justice. I mean, that is absolutely critical. No society can expect to have the confidence of its citizenry, much less the confidence of the wider world, whether it be investors or otherwise, unless you have a system of justice which allows for the adjudication and disposal of disputes, whether they're criminal or civil in nature, in a way that can't be faulted in terms of how long it takes to get the process to completion, and which can't be faulted in terms of the integrity of the process. People have to be convinced that the judges are in fact calling the shots in the cases that they preside over, that they're not being manipulated by politicians, and that they're not showing undue deference to the state in these matters. And I think we score very well there. I don't think there's anybody who can seriously argue that we do not have a judiciary that is of the utmost integrity. I think we can be very proud of that. We have good, solid, competent, for the most part, honest judges, certainly honest. I'm not aware of anybody who is sitting on the court against whom an allegation of dishonesty can plausibly be made. I think we're very good at that. And similarly, I think the idea of politicians calling up judges and trying to influence cases, that doesn't happen. That doesn't happen in the real world. And I think politicians know better, and I think judges certainly know better than to listen to them. Now, of course, judges don't live in an ivory tower. They read the newspapers.
They live amongst us.
Yes, and inevitably they're going to be influenced by their own, personal prejudices. But in terms of overt efforts to frustrate or corrupt the judiciary, I think we can be very, very proud of our record there.
As we get ready to go to another break, in 2002, Upon the return of power of the Progressive Liberal Party, Prime Minister Christie appointed you chairman of his transition team to advise him on setting up his administration. We'll recall to that same position in 2012. Do we have that kind of political mentoring going on these days? And I ask that because you led transition teams and they happen in other places. But is that something that happens regularly? And if not, why is that an important thing to have?
I think it's important because when you're selecting your cabinet, for example, when you're selecting key people for your administration, it's important to have more than just your eyes on the process. You want to consult as widely as you can. When I was chairing the transition team, the decisions, of course, ultimately were made by Prime Minister Christie, but there was very significant input that I was able to make as the chairman of the team. And in fact, there were other members of the team as well who were similarly, in a position to make input. So I think you ended up with a much better result than would have been the case if you just holed up in a room somewhere and tried to do it all yourself and suddenly came out and said, here's my cabinet.
To those of us in the media who have been doing this job through successive governments, it would seem sometimes that our politicians are not prepared for governance. What's different from when you served in the cabinet of a Lyndon and you watched the 82 and the 87 election when new faces came to cabinet? What's different about the preparation of our politicians?
I think generally, when I was in cabinet, I think the other members of cabinet were really well prepared to be there. As a matter of fact, a number of them, including myself, had declined offers of cabinet positions before. So Lyndon had first offered me a cabinet position in 1987. And I told him, frankly, I didn't think that I was in a position to do it, financially, for one. And frankly, I just didn't think I was there psychologically. That changed, 2 years later. I thought that I was ready to do it. But there were others like Dr. Bernard Nottage, who had gone through the same kind of process. He had been invited earlier to be a minister, and he decided that there were some things he was doing in the medical profession, some things he was doing in the sporting world here, that he wanted to see through to completion before he became a minister. So I think you had that kind of second guessing that I don't see nowadays. I think people, whether they're ready or not, in real terms, they're not going to pass up the opportunity.
Sure.
And so we ended up with a number of people. We have, in successive elections now, have ended up with a couple of people, not many, but a couple of people who, frankly, should have declined the offer and have said, no, I want to continue developing my profession. I want to continue solidifying myself financially, before I, venture forth.
Or even learning the parliamentary system and how
that's
it works.
That's an awful weakness we have.
Yeah.
And I think, I must say that when Prime Minister Christie was there, he saw to it that there were seminars conducted for the new MPs. Prime Minister Davis, I know, has done that as well. And I think it's important that we do that because, if you're new to the process, there is so much to learn.
It's like walking into a job.
Exactly.
The orientation.
Exactly.
We're going to hit pause on our discussion for now. This is On the Record. It's our final break. We'll be back right after this. From our studios on Marathon and Old Trail Road, this is On the Record. I'm your host, Jerome Sawyer, along with former Attorney General and former Chairman of the Progressive Liberal Party, Sean McWeeney. Sir, in 2022, you were appointed Chairman of the Constitutional Commission to review and recommend changes to the Constitution in advance of the 40th anniversary of independence. Why did we determine we needed to amend the Constitution at that time?
Well, we were coming up at the time on the 40th anniversary of independence. As you know, we've just celebrated the 50th. And I think it was felt by both the government and the opposition that this was an ideal opportunity to conduct a comprehensive review of the Constitution to see what we might need to change in the light of the actual constitutional experience of the country over the preceding four decades, bearing in mind that there hadn't been a single successful change to the Constitution in all that time. There had been two failed referenda, I think, by that time. We hadn't been able to get anything changed. And there were a number of things which we thought did need to change, or at least we needed to discuss with the Bahamian people. And so that was the context.
What are some of the articles that are still most in need of changing within the Constitution?
Oh boy. We ended up making 73 recommendations. They weren't all calling for constitutional changes, but a great many of them did. I can give you one example, which is one that's close to the subject we're discussing today, the administration of justice. And that is the retirement age for Supreme Court judges, which is age 65. It can be extended to age 67, but that's a relatively young age for a judge to retire in this day and age. I remember Mr. Telford George, as he refused to take a knighthood, Telford George, when he was Chief Justice here, and a very distinguished judge. He'd been Chief Justice in other Commonwealth territories as well. He always said, that this relatively youthful age for retirement for judges was a product of the colonial experience. Because he said that English judges tended to, as he put it, fade very quickly in the tropics. And very few of them lived beyond 65. So that was quite the thing back in the 50s and 60s. But he thought that it was low, and most people agreed with him. But we have tried now on two separate occasions to increase the age of retirement, and it's gotten swallowed up in all the other more controversial constitutional changes that were on the ballot, and this still hasn't happened. But I think it's a crying shame that you have judges who are still at the height of their powers, really, having to step down simply because you have this age of 65 or 67 as an absolute maximum. So that's just one example.
Sure.
But there are a host of other things. I mean,
one of them we're gonna delve into right now. I want to revisit a portion of the interview with Chief Justice Ian Winder last week, where he shared a personal view on the granting of citizenship that is still not automatic for children born in the Bahamas and does not allow for the seamless transfer of citizenship from women to their children. Let's take a look.
This again is my personal view. I think the law just needs to be passed, even if it's only by Parliament, to level the playing field for everybody. I don't know how anyone could be opposed to such an eventuality, but I think Parliament is empowered. But I know Parliament is empowered to make laws for peace, order, and good government, and certainly the provisions on citizenship permit Parliament to pass laws to equalize the playing field for men and women.
Chief Justice Ian Winder, your opinion on that matter, sir?
I think it's the next best thing. It's not the ideal solution. I agree with him that in the present circumstances, where you've tried on two separate occasions to get this passed in a referendum and it's failed, I agree that it's the next best thing available to do it by ordinary legislation. But I don't agree that it's the optimal solution, because I think the idea of having men able to claim their constitutional right to pass citizenship under the Constitution as the supreme law of the land is a lot stronger and a lot more robust than it is to have it by ordinary legislation. Ordinary legislation can be passed, can be revoked.
I was saying it can be passed and then repealed.
By the flick of a pen. Whereas if you put it in the Constitution, as you know, you have to go through this long process of having it passed by both houses of Parliament with supermajorities, after which it has to be passed in a popular referendum. So I don't agree that it's really sufficient as a long-term solution to have women, or a great many women, having to look to ordinary legislation for their ability to pass their citizenship, so to speak, to their children, whereas men are able to do it by reference to the Constitution, which is the supreme law. Everything should be on an equal footing, and the best place for that would be the Constitution. But I think what Ian has said is certainly the pragmatic solution, because it looks like the Bahamian people just don't have an appetite to make the Constitution change.
And I ask this question over and over, why is it, do you think, that we still do not have an appetite for this?
I think it's a combination of things. Xenophobia is a big thing. There's a sense of people who are, you're born here, that somehow, foreigners are trying to replace you or dilute your power. It's a cauldron of highly emotional, psychological things, which all come to bear on this question. It's interesting that when you do, in fact, have in-depth discussions with people on these things, that there are very few objective, rational reasons which are advanced. They usually are things which spring more from fears of the kind that I just mentioned.
Interesting. As we prepare to wrap up, I do want to just delve a little bit into the economy. What are some of the threats to our economy in the future? I mean, we're at 50 years. We've done well as a nation. We've made some mistakes, and we've paid for some of those mistakes over the years. But of course, the economy is always what people are looking at. But from where you sit, what are some of those threats to this economy going forward? A small state economy that's so reliant on a service industry, tourism, sometimes a very fragile industry. But what are some of the threats?
Well, you've touched on those, and those you're quite right to identify those as some of the major concerns. We have two primary industries in the Bahamas. One, of course, is much bigger than the other, but the two are tourism, and the other is what we generically call financial services. Our financial services industry is still under threat, grave threat, and it has been under this threat for the last 20 years, 23 years almost to be precise. And each year finds us smaller than we were the year before. And this is directly attributable to the economic aggression from the OECD, where they are basically trying to put you out of business. And it's a very hypocritical approach that's used, because they decry things that happen in the Bahamas which are tolerated and countenanced in first world countries without complaint. I maintain that the biggest offshore havens in the country today are actually in the United States. Places like Montana and the Dakotas, Delaware. But of course, the OECD is not going to take on the might and power of the United States. But the fact of the matter is that if you look at the number of Bahamians employed in the financial services industry today compared with what it was 20, 30 years ago, if you look at the number of institutions that are here now compared with the number we had 20, 30 years ago, we are really now a shadow of our former self.
It was the industry to get into?
Absolutely. It had the best paying salaries in the country. The professional middle class that we like to boast about was firmly rooted and was to a very large extent attributable to the success that Bahamians had achieved in the financial services industry. And of course, all of that is gone now. That's a major threat. In terms of tourism, again, one of the sadder aspects of the tourism industry today, compared with the way it was 30, 40 years ago, is to see how Bahamians have really not been able to attain the upper ranks the way that they were before. Nearly all of the hotels, with few exceptions, are headed by non-Bahamians in real terms. And that represents retrogression as well. Similarly, I should have mentioned when I was dealing with the financial services sector, you see the same thing today. There are very few Bahamian heads of institutions compared with the number that you would have had 20, 30 years ago. So that's a major threat as well. Tourism more broadly, I think the fact is, we have a tied product. We take advantage of the fact that, we're very close to the United States, so that sort of gives us a natural advantage. It's cheaper to run cruise ships to Nassau than it is to run them down further south. So that gives us an advantage too. But we have a tied product. If anybody who walks down Bay Street has to hang his head in shame, really. It's a disgrace.
Yeah.
So we need to put a lot more into investing in a tourism product which is really attractive and can stand on its own merits. We don't have that today.
John McWeeney, we have a lot of work to do within the next 50 years, but thank you for being a part of building of the Bahamas today. We appreciate you and all that you've meant to this country and what you've given us and helped to establish us in so many ways. And so we appreciate it all the best. Thank you for coming on. It was a great conversation. I'm sure we could have gone on for much longer,
yes,
but time will not permit. But you certainly have an open invitation to return.
Thank you very much. I always watch your show.
Thank you.
I'm a great fan of yours. I think you have one of the few shows. Well, two things. One is that you allow your guests to talk, which distinguishes you, and also the in-depth coverage that you give to these issues and the intelligence and the provocative spirit that you bring to this kind of journalism is something much to be encouraged and applauded.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Very kind words. And again, thank you for being our guest tonight. That's going to do it for our show tonight on The Record. Thanks to my guests and, of course, to our viewing audience. Make sure that you tune in again next week for another great guest and exciting topic. Until then, I'm your host, Jerome Sawyer. Good night, everyone.